I have counted a great many things in my life. Rations to the gram, berths to the bunk, water to the liter, the living and the dead when it came to that. A man in my trade learns early that a number is a promise. You write it down and it becomes a thing you owe. I have filed manifests off 9 worlds, and I have made my peace with the ones that came back short, because that is the arithmetic of the work and no amount of grieving changes a column of figures. But I will tell you about the world where the arithmetic came out whole, and I will tell you plainly, because it is the only story I have that ends with no blank line at the bottom of the page. We came late to the Concord's table. Humanity, I mean. We were the youngest voice in a room that had been speaking for 100,000 years before our star ever cooled enough to hold water, and the older voices had a way of making that clear without ever saying it aloud. When the distress came off Marell, it did not come to us. It came to the Concord, to the great deliberative bodies who kept the ledgers of who was worth the reaching, and it was heard, and it was weighed, and it was declined. I have read the finding since. It is a sober document. It speaks of transit costs and hull hours and the projected loss of relief assets against the projected number of the saved, and it concludes, in language that took 12 of their species to agree upon, that the evacuation of Marell was not a viable expenditure of shared resource. Non-viable. That is the word they used for 11 million people and the ocean that made them. Marell turned under a star named Asun, and Asun was dying. Not in fire, the way our old stories imagine a star's death, all flare and fury. Asun was dying in cold. It had begun to fold in on itself, dimming season over season, and as its light thinned, the great ocean of Marell began to freeze from the poles inward, a white rind creeping toward the warm equatorial deeps where the Marell had built everything they were. Astronomers put the final collapse somewhere inside a 9-month window. 9 months for a world to give up its warmth. 9 months for a people to decide how they wish to end. The Marell are a water people. I did not understand what that meant until I stood among them, and I am not sure I understand it now. They breathe air and they walk on land, but they are born in the shallows and they die in the deeps, and the ocean is not a place they live so much as the thing they are made of. Their skin is pale and half clear, and beneath it a soft light moves, slow currents of it, blue and green, brightening when they are moved and dimming when they are still, so that a room of Marell in low talk looks like a tide pool at dusk, all quiet glow and shifting shadow. When one of them dies, the light goes out of them the way it goes out of the sky, gradually from the edges in, and there is no mistaking it for anything but what it is. They had prayed in their way. They had signaled and they had pleaded and they had sent their finest to the Concord's chambers to argue for their lives, and they had been answered with the sober document and its sober word. And then they had done a thing I have thought about every day since. They had stopped asking. They had turned back to their freezing world and begun, without complaint, to arrange their own ending. They opened their deep archives and set their eldest to remembering. They chose which of their songs would be sung last. They resolved, as a people, that if the galaxy had measured them and found them not worth the cost, then they would go down into the cold with dignity and take their bitterness with them, and they would not beg the stars a second time. That is where we came in, not to a plea, to a silence a people had chosen because the asking had cost them too much the first time. I was berthing chief aboard the Almoner, a hospital ship, the largest thing humanity had ever pushed between stars, and if I am honest, she was not built for this. She was built for our own, for colony fevers and mining disasters and the long, slow work of keeping our fragile expansion alive. She had wards and water and 1,000 hands trained in mercy, and she had never in her life turned that mercy on a body that was not human. We did not have a mandate. I want to be clear about that, because in the telling it gets tidied up into something nobler than it was. There was no vote. There was no grand chamber where humanity rose and declared itself. There was a signal picked up by a listening post at the edge of our reach, months old and decaying, the last honest transmission Marell had sent before it gave up asking, and there was a young officer on watch who could not let it go, and it went up the line, and somewhere a handful of people who had the authority to say yes said yes before anyone with the authority to say no could gather the words. We were not sent. We went. There is a difference, and the Murrith were the ones who taught me to feel it. We ran the numbers hard on the way out, because that was my job and I did it. 11 million was not a number the almoner could hold. It was not a number the almoner and everything we could beg, borrow, and drag out of dock behind us could hold. Not in one pass, not in three. The distances were wrong, the timeline was worse, and the honest projection, the human version of the conquered sober document, put our reach at a fraction of the whole. I remember the meeting where they laid it out. The captain and the surgeons and the flight officers and me with my birthing figures, and I remember the silence after, and I remember Commander Sunt looking around the table and saying, in the flat voice she used for the worst things, that a fraction was not zero, and that we would take the fraction, and then we would go back for another, and we would keep going back until the star made us stop or there was no one left to carry. Nobody argued. That is the part the conquered never understood about us. We are a young species and we cannot count as high as they can. But we had all, every one of us at that table, buried someone we could not save, and there is a kind of arithmetic that teaches, and a kind that only wounds, and we had all learned ours the wounding way. So we crossed the dark toward a star that was going out, and I sat with my birthing plan and did the only useful thing a man in my trade can do, which is to make the impossible into a list of smaller things and start solving them one at a time. The Murrith could not simply be stacked in bunks like our own. They needed water or near enough moisture, warmth, salt in the right proportion, or their skin would crack and their light would fail. So we tore out wards. We flooded holds. We ran the numbers on how much heated, salted water the almoner could carry and still fly. And then we ran them again on how much life that water could hold, and we turned our hospital ship into a moving sea, deck by deck. And we did it in transit, our engineers up to their elbows in it the whole way out, cursing and calculating and making a thing that had never existed because there had never been a reason for it to. By the time Marell's dim star swelled in the forward glass, the almoner was not a hospital ship anymore. She was an ark, and she smelled of brine, and every hold that could be flooded had been flooded and heated and made ready for a people we had never met. I will not forget my first sight of Marell. We came in under a sun the color of a banked coal, a sullen red-brown thing that gave heat like a memory of heat, and below us the ocean world turned, and it was going white. From the poles the ice had come down in vast pale plates, and the dark warm water was pulled back to a band around the middle of the world, shrinking as we watched, or seeming to. Along that dwindling band of open sea the lights of the Murrith cities glowed up through the water, soft and blue-green, the same light that moved under their skin, so that the whole living remnant of their world looked from orbit like a single wounded thing curled around the last of its own warmth, still glowing, refusing yet to go dark. They had not expected us. Understand that. They had made their peace. When our first hail went down, there was a long silence, and then a voice came back up, careful, disbelieving, asking us to confirm our origin and our intent. And when we did, when we said we were human, and that we had come to carry as many of them off their world as our hulls would hold, there was another silence longer, and then the voice broke in a way I had no translation for and did not need one to understand. The one who came up to meet us was called On Vale, and he was, of all things, a harbor master. Their word for it does not translate cleanly, but that is the shape of it, the one who runs the docks, who counts the boats in and the boats out, who knows to the hull how much a berth will hold. In another life he and I would have been the same man, and I think we both felt it the moment we met, because the first thing he did, after the formalities, after the disbelief, was to ask me for my numbers. Not our intentions, not our courage, my birthing figures, how many, in what time, with what water. He was a harbor master and a world was ending, and the only thing he knew how to do with the impossible was to make it into a list, and I loved him for it before I fully understood him, because it is the only thing I know how to do too. We stood together over the plan, the human and the Murrith, and we built the thing that would carry his people off their dying world. He was tall, taller than me, his skin gone dim with exhaustion and grief so that the light in him was banked low. And when I told him the number the almoner could take in the first pass, I watched that light flicker, and I watched him do the arithmetic I had already done, the arithmetic of the fraction against the whole, and I watched him understand that we could not take them all at once. He did not accuse me. He did not weep, though I would not have blamed him. He simply asked the next question, which was how soon we would come back, and I told him we would keep coming back until the star stopped us, and the light in him rose just a little at that, the way a low tide turns. The first birthing was the hardest thing I have ever run, and I have run some hard ones. They came up from the surface in their own craft, small and graceful and never built for space, and we brought them into the flooded holds, and I stood on a gantry above a sea that had been a hospital ward a week before, and I watched a people begin to leave their world. They came in families, in the pods and clusters the Marell arranged themselves into, the young held close, the old borne up, and there was no panic in them, none, and that was the thing that undid me. I have seen human evacuations. I have seen the surge and the crush and the ugly mathematics of fear, and I had braced for it, and it did not come. The Marell came aboard like a tide coming in, ordered, patient, each pod waiting its turn, the elders directing the young with small movements of light, and when they reached the water of our flooded holds, our human water, heated and salted by our engineers off a formula we had begged from their own physicians on the way in, they sank into it, and I saw the light come up in them, all through the hold at once. A slow blue-green blooming as 1,000 frightened people felt water close over their skin and understood, all together, that they were not going to die on their world after all. Vale stood beside me on the gantry through the whole of it. He did not go down into the water, though I could see he wanted to, could see the pull of it in him. He stayed at the counting station at the manifest because he was a harbor master and his people were coming through and someone had to count them, and he would not hand that to anyone, not even now. We counted them together, every pod, every name. He read them out in his own tongue, and our system took them, and I watched the number climb toward the figure I had promised him, and I watched him watch it too. And when the last pod of the first pass came aboard and the number matched, when the birthing was full and the manifest was whole for that pass, not one soul lost, not one name blank, he went quiet, and the light in him went very still, and then he said a thing to me that our translators rendered as "you came for the counting," which I did not understand until much later, and which I understand now as the highest thing one of his kind can say to another. Not "you came for us." You came for the counting. You came, and you did not simply grab what you could and flee. You came and you counted, and a count is a promise, and you meant to keep it. We filled the almoner and we ran for the transfer point where the rest of our flotilla was gathering, because by then it was a flotilla. That is the thing I have to make you understand about what came next. We had gone out ahead, the almoner alone, because she was ready first and the star would not wait. But behind us, humanity had not been idle. The signal that one watch officer could not let go of had gone up the line and kept going, and while we flew, back in our own worlds, ships were being emptied of cargo and flooded and turned toward Marell. Freighters, colony transports, a grain hauler the size of a city that they gutted and salted and sent out crewed by volunteers who had signed on for a harvest run and found themselves crossing the dark toward a dying star instead, and not one of them turned back. By the time we made our second pass, the sky over Marell was full of human hulls, ugly ones, mismatched ones, ships that had no business between stars pressed into a service they were never built for, and every one of them flooded and warmed and made ready to hold a people that was not ours. The Marell watched us come the second time and the third, and I do not have the words for what was in their faces. Vale tried to give me one once. He said his people had a concept, a thing they told their young, that in the long dark between the stars each people is alone and must husband its own light because the light of one people cannot warm another. It was not cruelty, he said. It was simply the truth as they had always known it. The conquered had proven it. 11 million lives measured and declined, because the arithmetic of the dark is that no one comes for the counting but your own. And then we had come, a people so young we barely had a history, a people they had never met, a people with no debt to them and no reason and no mandate. And we had flooded our hospital ship and gutted our grain haulers and crossed the dark to carry off a world that was not ours, and it had broken something open in him that he did not think could be opened. Not the fear, the other thing, the old certainty that light could not cross that distance. We had crossed it, we had come for the counting. I want to tell you the arrival was clean and the rescue was sure, but that is not the truth, and I will not tell it to you that way, because the truth was harder, and the truth is where the worth of the thing lives. The conquered found us. They had declared the evacuation non-viable, and a fleet of ragged human hulls making a viable evacuation of the thing they had declared impossible was an embarrassment they had not planned for. A conquered observer detachment arrived in system on our fourth pass and hailed us with great courtesy and asked us, with great courtesy, by what authority we conducted an unsanctioned mass movement of a client population, and cited us, with great courtesy, the finding and its sober word, and advised us with great courtesy that our operation exceeded safe parameters and risked our own vessels and lives to no defensible end, and that we should withdraw. I was on the bridge when the reply went out because Commander Sunt wanted the berthing figures in front of her when she answered, and she read them off the plate I handed her, the number carried and the number remaining and the number of days the star had left, and then she keyed the channel and she did not raise her voice. She thanked them for their concern. She told them we were a sovereign operation acting on our own authority and our own account, and that we would answer for our own hull hours and our own lives to our own people, and to no one else. And then she said the thing that I have quoted 100 times since and never gotten quite right, the thing that went around the whole flotilla within the hour and around humanity within the year, and I will give it to you as near as I can. She said, "You measured them and found the cost too high." We measured the same cost. We simply did not agree that a life is what you divide the cost by. And then she closed the channel and turned to me and asked for the next pass to be brought forward, because we had lost an hour to courtesy and the star had not. The conquered did not stop us. I think they could have. I have wondered since why they did not, and I have decided it is because they did not understand us well enough to know where to push. They were 100,000 years old, and they had reduced mercy to a ledger so long ago that they no longer remembered it had ever been anything else. And they looked at us and saw a young species making an expensive mistake, and they warned us of it in good faith, and then they stood back to watch us fail. They did not understand that we were not making a mistake. We were paying a price. We knew exactly what it cost. That was the whole of it. We knew, and we paid it anyway, and there is no line in any ledger for that, and it was the one thing their 100,000 years had never taught them to read. So we kept going back, pass after pass. The almoner and the grain hauler and the ugly flooded freighters, down into the dimming light and up again heavy with a people. And each time the band of open water on Marell was thinner, and each time the ice had come further down, and each time on Vale met me at the counting station with a number that was smaller than the last, because a number that was smaller than the last meant more of his people were already gone up and safe. And we counted, and the manifest grew. And I watched a people that had resolved to die be carried, pod by pod and name by name, off their freezing world and into the warm salt holds of ships that had crossed the dark for no reason, but that we could not stand to let them go. I got to know some of them in the way you do. There was a Murrith child, I will not make her into a symbol, they hate that and so do I. She was simply a child, who fixed on me during the third pass and would not be parted from the gantry when her pod went down to the water, and stood beside me instead, small and glowing faintly, and helped me count. She had no words I could understand, and I had none she could, but she understood the counting, they all did. It was the thing that reached across between us, and she stood at my elbow and touched the plate each time a pod came aboard, one small clawed finger, once per pod, keeping her own tally against mine. And when the numbers agreed at the end of the pass, she looked up at me and the light in her went bright all at once, pure joy, the joy of a full count. And I have chased that feeling for 30 years in this trade, and gotten it maybe 4 times and never so clean. Her name went on the manifest. They all did. That was the thing on Vale and I built together and would not compromise on, not for the conquered, not for the star, not for anything. No blank lines. Every pod, every name, read and recorded and carried. Because a people who had been reduced to a number in a sober document and declined were going to be, in our accounting, a list of names. Every one of them. And when it was over there would be a record that said not 11 million, non-viable, but here is who they were. And here is who we carried. And here is the count. And it is whole. It came down to the last of it faster than we wanted. Us unfolded further and the folding fed on itself, the way these things do at the end, and the band of open water on Marell closed toward nothing, and the physicians told us that below a certain warmth the mureth in the water would begin to fail even before the freeze reached them, and the timeline that had been 9 months and then 3 and then weeks became, on a bad watch, days. We had carried a great many. The flotilla had grown and grown, and the numbers were staggering. A thing no one had thought possible, a thing the conquered had called impossible in a document 12 species had signed. But a great many is not all, and on Vale and I both knew, without saying it, that we were coming to the arithmetic of the fraction after all. And that when the star finally took the world, there would be some still on it, and that no manifest we could build would ever be whole while that was true. He did not go up. I have to tell you this part carefully because it is the part I understand least and feel most. On the last passes, on Vale would not board. He had places aboard, we had held them. He was the harbor master, and by every accounting he should have been among the first away and safe. He refused. He stayed at the counting station on the surface, at the last open dock in the last warm water, and he counted his people out, pod by pod, up into our ships, and he would not go while there was anyone left to count. I argued with him. Through the translators, over the failing channel, I argued with him the way I would argue with a man of my own trade who would not save himself. And he listened. And when I was done, he said a thing our systems rendered as the counting is not finished. And I understood that I could not move him, because it was the same thing that would have kept me. And you cannot argue a man out of the thing that makes him himself. The last pass, we ran ourselves to the edge. The almoner went down into a Marell that was almost entirely white, a world of ice with one dark bruise of open water left at its heart, and in that water the last of the mureth waited, and on Vale's light among them, dim now, so dim, banked down to almost nothing by cold and grief and days without rest. We took them up. Pod after pod, faster than was safe, our people in the flooded holds working past exhaustion, Commander Sunt on the bridge holding the ship in an atmosphere that was tearing itself apart as the star's death reached the world's air. And I stood on the gantry, and I counted, and beside me on the plate was on Vale's count coming up from the surface, the two of us running the same tally from 2 dying places, matching it pod for pod the way we had from the first hour. And it came down to the last pod. His, the harbor master's own, the last cluster off the last dock, and I watched it lift from the surface as the star gave its final fold in Asen's light, that had been dying for 100,000 years and dimming for 9 months and failing for days, went out. Not in fire, in cold. The banked coal sun simply closed, folded down into itself and was gone, and the last warmth went out of Marell in a breath. And the ice took the world entire, and the open water where the Mureth cities had glowed for 100 million years froze black and dark. The last pod made the hold. I was counting when it came aboard, the child at my elbow. She had stayed with me through all of it. We could not get her to a safer deck. She had appointed herself to the count, and her small finger came down on the plate as the pod cleared the lock, and my number and on Vale's number met and matched, and the manifest closed, and it was whole. Every name. 11 million names, carried across I do not know how many passes by, I do not know how many ships crewed by people who had crossed the dark for no reason, but that they could not do otherwise, and not one blank line. Not one. The Concord's non-viable made whole. On Vale came up the gantry with the last pod, borne by two of our people because he could no longer stand. His light gone down almost to nothing, and I went to him. And there was nothing in me that knew what to say, and it did not matter because he did not need me to say anything. He looked at the plate. He looked at the closed manifest, the whole count, the last number matched, and the light came up in him. From almost nothing, from the bank down dark he had let himself fall into so he could keep counting, the light came up, blue and green, all through him at once, and it was the brightest I had ever seen a Murrith burn, and he looked at me. And he said the thing that our systems rendered simply, without ornament, the way the deepest things are always rendered, and I will give it to you the way it came, because I have never found a better one. He said, "You came for the counting." And then he said the second half that I had not heard before, that I think he had been holding for the end. He said, "Now the count is whole. Now we are a people again and not a number they set down." I did not answer him. I have thought for 30 years about what I might have said, and I have never found it, and I think that is because there was nothing to find. Some things do not want an answer. They want a witness, so I stood witness. I stood on the gantry of a ship that had been a hospital and become an ark, above a hold full of a people we had carried off a dead world, with a Murrith child's small hand on the plate beside mine and the harbor master's whole light rising in front of me, and Marell dark and frozen in the glass beyond, and I did not say anything at all. I just made sure the count was right. It was. It is. It is the one manifest I ever filed with no blank line at the bottom, and I keep a copy of it, and I will keep it until I die. And I have told my own people that when I go it is to go with me, because it is the truest thing I ever did and the truest thing I ever saw, and it is only a column of names and a number that matches, and it is everything. We took them to warm worlds and open water. That is a longer story and not mine to tell. It belongs to the Murrith now, the making of their new home, and they are making it, and it glows. The Concord entered our operation into its records eventually, in a document nearly as sober as the first, and revised its finding, and I am told there was some quiet reckoning in its ancient chambers about what viable means and who gets to say it, and I hope there was, but I confess I do not much care. The Concord's opinion of the thing does not change the thing. We measured the same cost they measured. We simply did not agree that a life is what you divide it by. People ask me sometimes, younger ones in the trade, how we did it. How a young species with ships that were never built for it carried off a world that the oldest powers in the galaxy had declared beyond saving. They want a secret, some trick of logistics, some edge. And I tell them the truth, which disappoints them, because it is not a trick. I tell them we did it the way you do anything impossible, which is that you make it into a list of smaller things, and you solve them one at a time, and you do not stop, and you do not leave anyone off the list. I tell them a number is a promise. I tell them a count is a thing you owe. And I tell them about a harbor master who would not board while there was anyone left to count, and a child who kept her own tally with one small finger on the plate, and a manifest with 11 million names and no blank line. And I tell them that this is the whole of it, that there is no secret, that mercy is only arithmetic that refuses to round down. The Murrith have a place in their new cities, On Vale tells me, where they keep the count. Not a monument exactly. They do not build monuments to grief the way we do. It is a hall, and in it, in their soft moving light, they keep the names, all of them, the carried and the counted, in the order they came up off the world, and their young go there to learn the counting, because it is the thing that saved them, and they have made it holy. He sends me the reckonings on the anniversaries. I am on the list, he tells me, though I told him I do not belong there, that I only did my job, that I am a birthing chief and I count births and that is all. He does not accept this. He says I came for the counting, and that in his tongue there is no higher thing to say of anyone, and that I am on the list and will stay on it, and that when the young Murrith learn the names they learn mine among them, a human harbor master who counted their people up off a dying world and would not leave a single one behind. I let him keep me on the list. It is his count now, and a count is a promise, and I would not for anything ask him to leave a name blank.